All right. All right, last time we ended talking about how the Roman Empire survived the so-called crisis of the 3rd century AD, and how it survived that through the efforts of the so-called Illyrian or savior emperors, and probably the foremost of these emperors was Diocletian. You see his picture up there, and he it's kind of like the architect of the dominate, in the same way that Augustus or Octavian was the architect of the Principate. He came to the field in a period of crisis, just like Octavian did, Augustus, and he dealt with it and came up with some solutions to problems of the day. And we talked about what he did. Today we're going to talk about the fall of Rome. The collapse. Where the dominate gave Rome kind of a remission. It gave it. It kind of stopped the flow. It stopped the flow of blood. Think of treating a patient. It stopped the pain, but it didn't cure the patient. The Roman Empire, as we'll see, a century after Diocletian, almost 200 years after him, it finally collapsed. And it collapsed in the sense that the western part of the empire, the Latin-speaking part of the empire, completely fell under foreign powers. So today we're going to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. Now, Roman civilization, as we mentioned earlier, owed a great deal to Greek civilization. And we can even speak of Greco-Roman classical civilization and how it established a model and established an inspiration for the cultures that followed, especially in Europe in particular. But it wasn't the only classical culture. And when you look at the other parts of the world, today we're going to be looking at India. There was a period of classical India. There was developments in the classical age of Indian history, and the cultures and the ideas and the art, the aspects of the civilization, of Indian civilization that developed in that classical period, served as a model and inspiration for centuries. When you talk about the history of the Indian subcontinent. And the same is true of China. There was a classical period of Chinese history that set the tone and established the model that subsequent civilizations in China and in the Far East. Because when you talk about China, it's important to remember that China, its influence extended beyond the borders of what is today China, into Southeast Asia, into Japan, into Korea. So its influence was far felt in the Far East. All right, so that's what we're going to be doing this week, is talking about finishing up Rome and talking about the influence of classical civilizations in other parts of the world as well. So anyway, so let's finish up the Roman Empire. Now Diocletian, remember, we talked about what he did. He had set up that system where he divided the empire in two, and he was trying to deal with the question of succession, so you wouldn't have all these civil wars. So he set up a system where you had two Augusti, I guess, one in the east, one in the west, and then they would have a lieutenant, or a vice emperor known as a Caesar, to be their assistant. And so the empire was effectively divided into 4 parts. There were 4 emperors. And the idea was that, and Diocletian started it in 305 AD, he actually retired, built a great palace for himself in what is today Slovenia, I believe, and he retired, and his Caesar succeeded him. Now, this arrangement didn't last very long, because soldiers were instinctively loyal to the families of their emperors. For example, in 306 AD, one of the Augusti, his name was Constantius, he died while leading armies in Great Britain. And the soldiers, being loyal to him and to his family, declared his son Constantine, here's Constantine, to be the new emperor. Now that threw a wrench into the whole system, because that's not how it was supposed to work as it had been set up by Diocletian. And so what happened immediately was that all the other sons of emperors decided, hey, if Constantine's going to do it, I'm going to do it too. So what you had was another round of civil wars. Now, Constantine was a very successful general, and he was able to defeat, eventually, by about 324 or so, he was able to defeat all of his rivals and establish himself as sole emperor. And he in large part kept the system that Diocletian had established. The way he modified it was that you still had the empire divided up into 4 parts, but Constantine set up a system where you'd only divide it up among members of the family. So you had kind of hereditary succession. So Constantine made sure that only members of his immediate family, like his sons, could be fellow emperors. And that way you'd have more solidarity, and you'd have more the members of the royal family working together as a team, because they were all members of the same family or related to one another. So that was his kind of modification of the system set up by Diocletian. So you still had a divided empire because it was too big for one man to rule, but you had it all members of the same family or related to each other by blood. Another thing that Constantine different was that he decided that Christianity was not something that he wanted to fight against. Remember, Diocletian had set up a huge persecution of Christianity because part of his ideology under the Dominate was that the emperor was chosen by the gods to rule, and that the emperor was the visible manifestation of Jupiter, the main god worshipped by the Romans. And that's why Diocletian felt so strongly about trying to crush the Christians, because they did not worship the emperor. Now, Constantine, though, took a very different approach. He decided to legalize Christianity. In 313 AD, and while he was in Italy, he declared that Christianity was now a legal religion in the empire, and that it would be no longer subject to persecution, that they'd be able to build churches and worship freely without any fear. And also, the story was put out that he himself had converted to Christianity. There was a story told and it was told in his own lifetime, that when he was about to face off against a rival, his name was Maxentius, he was trying to face off in one of these civil wars, that before he went into battle, he had a vision where he saw a cross in the sky, and the cross said, written across the cross were the words, "With this sign you will conquer." And then, according to another story, he had a dream where Jesus himself appeared to him and told him to put the sign of the cross on his shield. So he put a cross on all the shields of his soldiers, and they went into battle the next day, and they wiped out the enemy, and they defeated the rival emperor. Was killed and drowned in a river, and it was a great victory for Constantine. And so, according to the story that was told, that was why he decided to legalize Christianity. Now, he actually never was baptized till his death. He waited till he was about to die before he was baptized as a Christian. But he was baptized before he passed away in 337 AD. And during his reign, he did, even though other religions were allowed, he did do some things, make some new policies. For example, he decided that he was going to ban idolatry. So he ordered that all the gold and silver statues and all the idols and all the temples of the Roman Empire be seized. And he melted all these statues into coins. And he actually restored a lot of the gold content to the coins by seizing all these gold and silver statues and melting them down to make money. So he also, his mother was a big Christian. She had converted and baptized, and she was a big patron of churches. In fact, she built a church at the site where the resurrection of Jesus was supposedly took place. and she built a church of the Holy Sepulchre. Built one of the first oldest Christian churches ever built. It was funny that when they started building churches, see, churches are very different from temples. You know, temples, pagan temples, were largely built to store the idol and to store dedications made to the gods. So temples were not built for public gatherings. Usually in a temple, in a Greco-Roman temple, that all the activities took place outside. You know, the altar was usually located outside before the temple, and that's where people gathered to sacrifice and have religious services. But with a church, you needed to have with the church services were a lot bigger deal. They involved a sermon usually, and so you had to have a place where that was covered. You needed a place where large amounts of people could gather on a regular basis, every Sunday. So what they did, the earliest churches were patterned after Roman law courts. A Roman law court was called a basilica, and it was a place where every Roman city had a basilica where you would have, it was a law court, and that's where law cases were held. And what the early churches did, beginning with Constantine, when they began to build churches. Now, before Christianity was legalized, they worshipped outdoors. We know they worshipped out on the outskirts of town, like in fields, or they worshipped in people's homes. But now that they were a legal religion, they could actually build churches. And so what they did is they took that basilica, the law court, and that became the church. And so instead of having the place where you used to have where the judge sat and heard cases, now that became where the pulpit was located, where the preacher, the priest or pastor would give the sermon. And the altar was where they took communion, ate the bread and drank the wine. That was located now right where the judges used to sit in the old law court. So and all churches since then have followed that model. I don't care if it's a Catholic cathedral or a Greek Orthodox church or even a Baptist church in the middle of somewhere. Most churches follow with the pews and the aisles and where the pulpit is. Those are all built. They're all basically Roman basilicas. That's the model that was used. So it's interesting how Christians adapted an existing building type for their own particular worship service. And it was beginning with Constantine. Now that it was a legal religion, thanks to the Edict of Milan, churches began to pop up all over the Roman Empire, all these basilicas. Now, another thing that Constantine did, and you could almost call him kind of like the second founder of the Dominate, was that he decided to build a whole new city for his capital. And he built it in the east. He built it in what is today Turkey. It was a former city called Byzantium. It was an ancient city that had been around for centuries. And it had fallen into ruin. And so he rebuilt the city and renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And when he built this city, when he founded the city in 330 AD, as he was a Christian, it was a city that had no pagan temples in it at all. It didn't even have gladiator combats because Christians frowned on that. Now, he did build a giant chariot races. Now, chariot races were a hippodrome or a chariot place, a chariot building where you could watch chariot races. That they were still pretty violent, but they weren't. It was a horse race, basically a chariot race, but it wasn't quite as frowned upon by Christians. So he did have a huge hippodrome he built in it. But it didn't have all the pagan temples that were associated with ancient cities. So it was really one of the first Christian cities ever built. And it included basilicas as well, churches for Christians to worship. And it quickly became one of the biggest cities in the world because it was the main capital. Remember, every emperor had his own capital, but this was the biggest capital. And it quickly eclipsed Rome itself as one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire because it was the center of the government administration, the center of government with this new empire. Now, another thing that Constantine did was that he kind of modified the Dominate to a certain extent. Christians were so happy that they weren't being killed and murdered and thrown to the lions and executed that many Christians came to believe that Constantine himself, they believed the story about Constantine, believed it was a miracle, believed that God had intervened on their behalf and helped to convert Constantine. So many Christians came to believe that Constantine was chosen by God to rule, that he was a divinely inspired figure. And so what happened was that many Christians came to believe that the emperors were themselves divinely inspired, that they were chosen by God. So they weren't to be worshipped, but they were still figures to be revered. There was almost a sacredness surrounding them. So the dominant idea that power came from God was continued, but the Christians embraced this idea and came to believe that emperors were given their power by God and should be respected and obeyed because their power came from God above. Now, that was a big change because Christians up to this point had very strange feelings about Rome. And many Christians felt that the Roman government was the Antichrist and were very critical of the Roman government. But now that all changed. Now that the Roman government was a Christian government, then all of a sudden now Roman emperors got their power from God. Now that wasn't the only change that happened to Christianity in the 4th century AD. The 4th and 5th centuries AD was a time when the Christian, as a religion, Christianity as a religion, underwent some very big changes. For one of the things that happened was that you began to see the idea that the government should enforce right belief. In other words, it became the job of the government to ensure that, or to persecute anybody who didn't follow the church's position on a particular issue. See, Christianity had always had a lot of different debates. You know, when it was a persecuted religion, there had always been groups of people who had gone their own way and had maybe a different view of Jesus or a different religious belief, and that had been the way it had been since the founding of the religion. And usually that it wasn't a big, since Christianity wasn't an illegal religion anyway, it didn't matter because these disagreements didn't matter to the Roman state. Now, when Constantine became emperor, when he embraced Christianity, he decided that it was very important that all the Christians be on the same page. And so now, at the time that Constantine was emperor, there was a big debate over who Jesus was. There was one group of people called Arians. They followed a man by the name of Arius who believed that Jesus was just a man. He was more than a man. He was divinely inspired by God. He preached the word of God, but he was a man. Now, the majority view among Christians had always been that Jesus was a divine man, that he was both God and man at the same time. And so there was a big debate, and it was dividing the church. And so now Constantine didn't want to deal with a divided church. So he decided to get all the leaders of the church, all the bishops, all the leaders of the churches together, and they met at a place called Nicaea, it was near what would become Constantinople. It was in what is today Turkey. And they had this big gathering, and at this gathering it was decided to go with the majority view that was believed to be the traditional view at the time, that Jesus was God. And they affirmed this idea of what is known in Christian doctrine as the Trinity, that God has three persons: the Father, the Son, Father, God Creator, Jesus, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that these they're three persons but one God. And they came up with a formula. It was called homoousia. That all these persons are of the same substance. And this became the official Orthodox position taken by the church. Well, in the years that followed, the Roman government decided that in their capacity to regulate religion, because in the history of Rome, the state had always regulated religion, the Roman state decided that they had to enforce orthodoxy. In other words, if people did not agree with the official position, the Orthodox position, they could be subjected to punishment, even imprisonment. So in the 4th century and in the centuries to follow, the Roman government established a precedent where the government, the secular government, would be involved very strongly in governing the church and enforcing orthodoxy, enforcing that everybody be on the same page and not allowing any kind of different opinions to be out there. And that was something new in the history of Christianity. I mean, Christianity had never been a legal religion. Now it was a legal religion. It became subject to Roman regulation. So in the Roman concept of government, the church and state were one and the same. So it made sense now that Christianity was a legal religion within Rome. It made sense to the Romans that Christianity be governed by the Roman state, the church and the state be one. So that was a big change in the history of Christianity, because that had not been the case in its previous history. Now, another development that happened was the development of monasticism. And we get the word monasticism from monk. Monks. What had happened in the history of Christianity was that up to this point, up until its legalization, people who wanted to devote themselves, who were very devoted to the faith, were martyrs. You know, these were the people who gave up their lives rather than renounce Christianity. But now that Christianity was a legal religion in the 4th century A.D., there was no real way for somebody to just kind of show their ultimate regard for Christianity. There was no need for martyrdom anymore, because there were no martyrs. Christianity was now a legal religion. But some people believe that they could, a monk was someone, or a hermit or a monk were people who believed that they could show their devotion to the faith by completely denying themselves all earthly comfort, just kind of making themselves dead to the world. Now, a hermit would be somebody who would kind of go off on his own and live an isolated life and dedicate his life to prayer and to doing good deeds, and just kind of not marrying, not owning any possessions, being very poor, making himself dead to this world, living ultimately for the next world, for the spirit. And but in the 4th century, there was a man by the name of Pachomius. I didn't put his name up here, but there was in Egypt. Pachomius led this movement where people who were hermits, instead of living isolated lives, they would live in a community where a monk, unlike a hermit, a monk lives in a community. These are a group of men who live together, but have completely given up all earthly pleasures, so that they live a life completely devoted to God, to the Scriptures, to the preaching, and to doing good works. And they don't eat lots of food. They don't have sex. They don't own possessions. Everything they own is simple and sparse, and it's a life that's ideally the life they're supposed to live. Now, and so in Egypt, you see these monasteries. Usually they're located out in the desert, away from the rest of society, and you see these monasteries built. And within the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, monasticism spread to other parts of the Roman Empire. It spread into Palestine, into Turkey, and it came to the west, it came to Italy, it came to Gaul, and it spread all over the place. You have these monastic communities being set up. Now, these would be important in the history especially of the West, because during the Middle Ages, monasteries would be one of the few places where you'd find literacy, where you'd find learning, because the monks would be the only people who would know how to read, and because they were devoted to the study of the Scripture. And so monasteries, with the fall of the Roman Empire, monasteries would be very important in preserving literacy and knowledge down through the ages. But it was something that got started in the 4th century A.D. and spread very rapidly within the Roman Empire. Now, another thing that was happening was that Christianity was becoming a lot more anti-world. I guess I don't know what the world I'm saying. Maybe not anti-world, but anti-pleasure, anti-living, this life. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that Christianity in the 4th century had a big rival. There was another major world religion out there that was very, very popular in the 4th century, and it's called Manichaeism. The founder of Manichaeism, I put his name here in italic, was Mani. Mani lived in what is today Iraq, in southern Iraq, and he was of Jewish descent, and he lived in southern Iraq in the 3rd century A.D. And he decided that Jesus was just one of a number of prophets sent by God, that he was a successor to Jesus, and that he preached this message where the world that we live in is evil, and everything associated with this world is evil, and therefore the only way to achieve eternal life is through denying oneself all pleasures of this world, and that the way to achieve salvation is through knowledge and living this very strict life. And so the followers of Mani, the Manichaeans, believed they didn't eat meat, they didn't hardly eat anything. They were vegetarians who just starved themselves, and they didn't engage in sexual relations of any kind. They owned no possessions, and they lived kind of like monks did. And but it was a religion that said that the reason why the world was so evil is because they thought that Satan had created the world. Manichaeans took the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, and adapted it to their own set of beliefs. And so they believed that the devil was the creator of the world. That's why everything in the world was evil. That's why you had to, and they believed that Jesus and now Mani had been sent by God to save people from the evils of this world and to help them deny themselves this world so they could achieve eternal life. And so the Manichaeans were very big, very popular, and some historians believe that the Christianity knew that the Manichaeans were popular, and so they adopted some of their more popular ideas so that Christianity would be more popular. So, like in the 4th and 5th century, all of a sudden, priests were no longer allowed to marry. It was, if you look at the early history of the church, marriage was fine. Peter was married, for crying out loud. Peter, the apostle Peter, was married, and many of the leaders of the church were married. You could be a pastor, you could be and be married. But in the 4th century AD, they decided, no, we must be more like the Manichaeans. No more marriage. I mean, if you want to be a priest, if you want to be in the church, you can't marry at all. You have to be celibate, and that's the only way. And they also became more and more, they kind of competed with the Manichaeans to see how they could deny themselves the pleasures of this world. So monks would starve themselves. Monks would even beat themselves. They go around beating themselves and disfiguring themselves and say, "I don't care about my body. All I care about is Jesus." And they walk around, they deform themselves, and they would chain themselves to walls. There was this whole group of monks who chained themselves to columns. They would live on a column and chain themselves to the column so they wouldn't fall off the column when they were sleeping. And they would there was this one guy, they were called stylites. He was chained to this column for so long that his skin got all gross because of the chain, and maggots got in there, and he would eat the maggots. And he said, "I will only eat the maggots for my food." And he lived for like 20 years off of maggots and water. I mean, and everybody thought, "Oh, what a great saint." But that became, because Christians, they wanted to show, those Manichaeans, they might think they're otherworldly, but we're a lot better. We're more otherworldly than they are. We're going to show them. And it was like these monks and these hermits competed with one another to show how unworldly they were, how much they just despised their own flesh, how much they were willing to sacrifice, starve themselves, eat maggots, live horrible lives, just to show the world how unworldly they were. It's kind of ironic, though, because they were in competition for worldly fame through being unworldly. So they were kind of being hypocrites, if you think about it. But anyway, but that became the norm. And so this rivalry between Manichaeanism and Christianity became so intense that it changed the kind of the organization and the views of the Christian church. So the 4th century was a big change. It marked some major changes in the history of Christianity, and those changes would continue into the Middle Ages and beyond. All right, now, so let's talk about the fall of Rome. Now we've talked about how Diocletian and Constantine, through the dominate, kind of staved off collapse, gave kind of new life to the Roman Empire. So what happened? Why a little less than 200 years after Constantine did the Roman Empire eventually collapse? Now, when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we're talking about the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because the empire in the East, with its capital of Constantinople, it would survive and would eventually evolve into the Byzantine Empire over the course of the Middle Ages. But the empire in the West, Italy, Gaul, North Africa, Spain, Britain, that part of the empire would collapse and cease to exist after 476 AD, the traditional date for the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. So what happened? Now, historians spend a lot of time talking about Rome and why it collapsed. And there are a couple of different factors put into effect. Some people point to economic decline. They'll point to the fact that, looking at the 3rd century in particular, you had plagues, you had famine, you had inflation. People point out that Rome was sending many of its precious metals, its gold and silver, overseas to China and to India for spices and silks, and that flow of gold and silver drained Rome's economy, hurt its currency. So some people point to those factors. They point to that as part of the dominate included very, very heavy taxation. And the taxes were so high that in many parts of the Roman Empire, wealthy people fled the cities and would build estates in the countryside to avoid, as much as possible, having to pay these heavy taxes. So some people point to the heavy toll that these taxes took. Just to support this huge army, these taxes were just draining the life of the Roman Empire. So people who point to economic decline, they point to the high taxes and the dominate. They point to the recurrent problems with inflation, with plagues and famine and population decline. So that you could make a good case for economic decline. But the problem is that this economic decline was not everywhere. Like if you look at the archaeological evidence, you can find in places like Syria or in Britain or in many parts of the Roman Empire that the 4th and even the 5th century were times of strong economic growth. There was population growth in some parts of the Roman Empire. I mean, there was population decline, definitely, and cities were in decline in many parts, like along the Rhine River and in Gaul, especially areas that were in the Danube, areas that were subject to frequent attacks by barbarian tribes. You could make a case for the decline of cities in those areas, but if you went to Britain, or if you went to Syria, or you went to North Africa, you'd find a case where cities were growing. There was evidence of economic growth and population growth. The construction of basilicas alone. In many parts of Greece and in Turkey, they found basilicas, churches were being built all over the place. And that seems to point to economic security, that they had the money to build these elaborate churches in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. So, if you want to make the case for economic decline, you have to say, well, what about all these areas of the Roman Empire that our archaeological evidence point to as flourishing? So that's the problem with looking at economic decline. Some people point to the Roman Empire collapsed due to its corruption of its spirit, its immorality and corruption. And you could look at the Roman Empire and see that there was a lot of immorality and corruption. Just look at some of these emperors, Nero and Caligula, and the fact that you had officials who were willing to accept bribes and were very corrupt. And that was true even in the time of the 5th century, where you had government bureaucrats who accepted bribes or only thought of benefiting themselves and didn't care about the empire as a whole. So corruption was a problem. The problem with that argument is that the Roman Empire had corruption in the first century, and it still lasted 400 years. So that problem with the corruption theory is that the Roman Empire always had to deal with corruption. We know that Pontius Pilate was corrupt and taking bribes. But he lived in the first century. The Roman Empire would last another 300, 400 years before it would fall. So the problem with corruption theory is that why you had corruption in the first century, you had corruption in the 5th century. Why did corruption cause the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, but not the 1st century? See? So that's the problem. Now, another theory is that the Roman Empire fell because of Christianity. There was a famous historian named Edward Gibbon who lived in the 18th century. He believed that Christianity kind of sucked out the spirit of the Roman Empire. He believed that the Roman Empire was built on people being loyal to the state above all, and that Christianity divided the loyalty of people. People were more thinking about the next world rather than this world, and therefore they weren't as committed as they needed to be to defending the Roman Empire from attacks and keeping the empire whole and together. And so that was Gibbon's theory. Now, there was a book written by a man by the name of St. Augustine. He's considered one of the fathers of the church. He lived in about the 430 A.D., and he was a very influential writer, Catholic writer, Christian writer. And he lived at a time when the Roman Empire was being attacked by barbarians, and many people were saying, well, even at that time, there were many pagans who were saying, well, the Roman Empire is being attacked because we have abandoned our traditional religion. We've abandoned the religion of our ancient gods. We've embraced Christianity, and the gods are punishing us by sending these barbarians to destroy our cities. So as a response to that, St. Augustine wrote a book called City of God, which is one of the most influential books in Western literature. And he made the point was that he said that there are two states, there are two kingdoms. You had the kingdom of God, which was eternal, and it was represented by Jerusalem, and the heavenly Jerusalem as described in the book of Revelations. And so you had the one city of God would be the eternal kingdom of God, and then you had the city of men, like Rome. And all empires, he said, all earthly empires were meant for destruction because they were corrupt and sinful, and they were made by men, so they were destined for destruction. But the city of God, the eternal kingdom, would last forever. And some people have pointed out and said, look at St. Augustine. He's saying that if you're a Christian, you don't have to care about this world because we have the next world. You have the next world to live by. So who cares about whether empires come and go? So some people would say, look at St. Augustine and his city of God and say, see, there's the evidence, all you need. Roman Empire fell because people were too Christian and they weren't dedicated to keeping the Roman Empire alive and going. Okay, there's a problem with that theory as well, because St. Augustine was a very patriotic Roman. Even though he was a leader of the church, when his city was being attacked by barbarians, when Vandals, there were a barbarian tribe called the Vandals, were on the city, it was St. Augustine as the leader, one of the leaders of the city. He was the head of the local church, the bishop of the city of Hippo, where he lived. He actually organized the defense of the city. I mean, he was the guy leading the troops. I mean, he wasn't in battle, but he was organizing the defense of the city and helping his people, giving them food. And he wasn't the only one. If you look at a lot of these Christian bishops, they were very intimately involved in local government. And in fact, under Roman law, late Roman law, the bishop, the local church leader, the bishop was one of the leaders of the city. So many leading Christians were also leading Romans and very dedicated to the Roman state. In fact, another father of the church, St. Jerome, was devastated when he heard about the fall and the collapse of the Roman city, the sack of Rome in 410 A.D., and wrote a whole letter to one of his friends about how devastating he felt about the loss of the destruction of the city of Rome. So the problem with saying that Christianity caused the fall of the Roman Empire is the fact that you have case after case, St. Augustine being one of them, where Christian bishops were very loyal and very patriotic and very dedicated public servants dedicated to serving Rome. So that kind of throws a wrench into that theory. Now, another theory is that the Roman Empire was destroyed by barbarian invasions, and that these attacks were just too much for the Roman. Being attacked on multiple fronts by these barbarian peoples was just too much, and that's what caused the Roman Empire to fall. So let's talk about that a little bit. Talk about the barbarian invasions, because you can make a case that all of these factors were involved, and that the barbarians were just the tipping point. They finally caused the apple to fall off the tree. But the Germanic barbarians definitely were the active agent in bringing about the final destruction of the Roman Empire by 476 AD. Now, to talk about barbarian invasions, you have to go back a little bit. You have to go back to the Huns. The Huns were a people from Central Asia. They were related to the Turks and the Mongols. Their homeland was here in what today would be Chinese Turkestan, Uzbekistan, and they moved west. They crossed the Eurasian steppes, and they were ferocious horsemen. They were great warriors. Now, when they attacked the Goths, some of the Goths, called the West Goths or Visigoths, to avoid being conquered by the Huns, the Visigoths decided that they were going to migrate into the Roman Empire. So these Visigoths, in 378, a group of Visigoths, they asked if they could enter into Roman space and live within the Roman Empire to avoid being conquered by the Huns. Well, the Romans initially said, great, we can use these guys as soldiers, we can recruit among them, so let's allow this huge migration to occur. So the Visigoths crossed the Danube River, and a huge mass of people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them, but the Romans had no way of feeding them. And then Roman officials, this is where the corruption comes into play, Roman officials were charging these people huge sums of money for food and for clothing, doing everything they could to exploit them. And so eventually these Goths, these Visigoths, they were warriors, they were Germans, by golly. They had enough of that, and they decided to wage war on Rome. And at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, the Roman army was destroyed by the Visigoths. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. I mean, they hadn't been defeated this bad since the days of the Gauls back in the 4th century BC. It was a horrific defeat. 60,000 men killed, legions destroyed, and it was a devastating blow to the Roman army. Now, the only way that the Romans could recover, the emperor was Theodosius. Theodosius, when he became emperor, he decided the only way to deal with this was to basically recruit barbarian tribes into the army. I mean, barbarians already had arms, and they're already trained to fight, so why not recruit them? So instead of recruiting from within, he recruited all these barbarians, and eventually he came to terms with the Visigoths. Now, he didn't defeat the Visigoths and drive them out of Rome. Instead, he gave them huge tracts of land if they agreed to keep quiet and keep the peace, and agreed to serve as soldiers, as army soldiers in the Roman army. So Theodosius he inherited a situation where the empire was collapsing, and he was able to make the most of it, but at the price of basically just using barbarian soldiers as the main source of troops for the Roman army. And that was a problem because these barbarian warriors who were being recruited and trained and being brought into the Roman Empire, they had no loyalty to Rome. They didn't care about whether Rome lived or died. They just fought for booty and for spoils, and by booty I'm not talking about talking about spoils of war, not anything sexual or anything. But anyway, but that's what they fought for. And now Theodosius, when he became emperor, he ruled for for 18 years, and he was the emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Under Constantine, had legalized Christianity, but under Theodosius, Theodosius ordered all the pagan temples to be closed, and he forbid the worship of any other gods, and he made Christianity the only acceptable legal religion within the Roman Empire. And that's why he was known as, by Christian authors, as Theodosius the Great, or Theodosius the Catholic, Catholic being the universal church. And many people, many pagans, they would look to him and say, well, that's when all the problems began, because he disavowed the traditional religion of Rome to become making Christianity the only religion and shutting down all the temples. That's why 392 was the last time the Olympics were held, because it was a pagan religious festival. After Christianity became the only acceptable religion, there were no more Olympic Games till 1896. But anyway, so now Theodosius, like Constantine, only trusted members of his family to rule, and so he arranged for his sons to succeed him, and he divided the empire in two. Honorius got the west, and Arcadius got the east. Now, one of the problems with hereditary succession is that Theodosius might have been a great general and a leader of men and a successful emperor, but his two sons were completely worthless. Honorius, for example, his favorite hobby was to feed chickens. I mean, that's all. He would spend all of his time feeding the birds. I mean, the guy was a little vacant, in other words. He was a little out there. I mean, he wasn't a violent guy. He wasn't like Caligula or killing people. He didn't kill, he killed some people who disagreed with him, but he wasn't a murderous guy. He was just kind of out there. So, now, at this particular time, when the empire was just being deluged with barbarian invasions, and now, in the Eastern Empire, you see, the Eastern Empire was a little more protected because, first of all, its eastern border, you had the Persians, and the Persians were civilized, and they could be dealt with through diplomatic, they could be paid off with gold, they could be worked with diplomatically. So the empire's eastern border was safe. And then Constantinople itself was a huge, giant walled city. Theodosius had built giant walls. You can still go and see the Theodosian walls today. So Constantinople was strategically located as a defensive barrier to protect Turkey. And so, the barbarians could invade the Balkans and get past the Danube easily, but they couldn't get past Constantinople. So the Eastern Empire, thanks to Constantinople and its secure border with the Persian Empire, the Eastern Empire was not subject to constant invasion. Now the Western Empire, it didn't have any kind of natural defense, and armies could cross the Rhine River. And in 406 AD, there was a real cold spell, and the Rhine River completely froze. And so it was no barrier, and barbarian tribes crossed the Rhine River from Germany into Gaul like in huge gulfs. They just crossed over the ice. And so during the reign of Honorius, basically the entire Western Roman Empire was under siege by barbarian tribes. A group of German warriors, the Angles and the Saxons, they crossed over on their ships from what is today Denmark and northern Germany, and they took over the Isle of Britain. And most of the Celts who were Christian fled to Ireland and to escape being conquered by the pagan Angles and Saxons. And when they invaded Britain, they brought their wives and children with them, and they brought their language as well. That's why in England they speak Anglish. From Angles, Angle, England. We get from the Angles. So many. The Anglo. You talk about Anglo-Saxons. If you're of English ancestry, you're Anglo-Saxon, because Angles and Saxons came in by the thousands and thousands and came in and settled in Great Britain. So Great Britain was lost to the Roman Empire. And the Christian Celts, they went to Ireland and built monasteries, and Ireland became a big center of culture because of all those Celtic monks who were English, not English, but Celtic and Romanized, and went and settled in Ireland to escape the fury of the Saxons and the Angles. Now other barbarian tribes, like the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Franks, they crossed over and they occupied Gaul and Spain at this time. Now, what happened though was that Honorius and his successors, they became so reliant. They relied on German warriors to fight other German warriors. And that wasn't the best arrangement, because a lot of times these German warriors that were supposed to fight for the Romans, they had no problem going over to the enemy. I mean, to them, it was all about who's going to offer you the biggest. They didn't have paychecks back then. Who's going to give you the most gold? Who is the most successful leader you can fight for? And so that created problems. Now, by the time you get to 476 AD, you had a situation where the German general, the German military leader who commanded the Roman armies, was the real emperor, was doing the job of governing the state, and the Roman emperor was just a figurehead. And now in 476 AD, the last figurehead of the Roman Empire in the West was a man by the name of Romulus Augustulus. He was just a kid. He was just a figurehead. And the German military general who commanded the Roman armies was a man by the name of Odoacer. He was actually a German warrior. And he decided, this is ridiculous. You know, I do all the job of running Rome and running Italy. And, you know, by this time, Gaul and Spain and Britain had all been occupied by various Germanic tribes. And Odoacer figured, hey, I'm going to let my soldiers, we want a piece of the action. We want treasure. We want to run this place. So he forced the last Roman emperor in the West, he forced him to step off the throne, and Odoacer declared himself, you know, he didn't declare himself Roman emperor because he was a barbarian. He just declared himself ruler of Italy. And he divided up Italy among his troops and gave off land to his Germanic barbarian soldiers. And so when Romulus Augustus was forced off the throne in 476 AD, that marked the final end of the Roman Empire in the West, because now you had a barbarian running Italy. And you had other barbarian kings ruling over other parts of what had formerly been the Roman Empire in the West. So that is how barbarian tribes ended up bringing about the demise of the Western Roman Empire. Now, the question that historians have to ask is, how much were other factors involved? Was it just these barbarian invasions just wiped out everything? Or were they helped by other economic factors, cultural factors like the spread of Christianity? You know, what other factors played a role in helping the barbarians bring about the destruction of the Roman Empire? Or did the barbarians do it all by themselves, just by virtue of their strength and just power and drive? They just brought about and destroyed the Roman Empire. All right. So we're going to take a little break, but just as a review, after you use the restroom or stretch and all that, I want you in your groups. I want you to kind of review, write down some of the causes of the fall of the Roman Empire, and so we can just kind of review them in your brain and talk about them. And then write them down. Then I'll ask the group to kind of spout them off, and then you all can add to that. All right. So let's take our break. And right now we're going to move away from the West and from the Roman Empire and talk about another classical civilization that had far-reaching influence, and that would be the civilization of India. You know, when we talk about the civilization of India, we're talking about not just the modern nation of India, but we're also talking about areas that were included in that general framework, parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then Indian influence extended into Southeast Asia, into what is today Thailand, Cambodia, and even into Indonesia, in the islands of Sumatra, Java, you know, those areas. So when we're talking about Indian civilization, we're talking about an area, a large part of the globe, encompassing millions and millions of people today. All right, so let's talk about India. Now, when we last talked about India, we talked about the collapse of Harappan civilization and how India was, you see this migration of peoples from Central Asia and from Eurasia into India, and they were the Aryans. And the Aryans spoke an Indo-European language, which means that they were related to Iranians, Germans, French, English, Scandinavians, all those, an area stretching from Central Asia all the way to the British Isles, where Indo-European languages were spoken. It used to be completely I think I mentioned this earlier, it used to be completely acceptable to refer to Indo-Europeans as Aryan peoples. But after Hitler came along and decided that Aryan was his name for the German superior race, they decided to axe that idea. So now they use the much less melodious Indo-European to describe peoples that inhabited that part of the globe from Central Asia all the way to the British Isles. Now the Aryans were one of the earliest Indo-European peoples we know, and they migrated from probably the steppes of Asia. They brought their horses with them and their chariots, and they inhabited, originally they just inhabited the Indus River Valley of what is today Pakistan, but over time they expanded steadily southward into the Indian subcontinent. Now, one of the things they produced was the Rig Veda. Now, the Rig Veda was originally all oral. It was all these were hymns that were sung in honor of the gods, and they were written down centuries later. But they are some of the most ancient Indian poetry that we have. And the Rig Veda talk about the gods that they worship. Now, if you're a Hindu, in India today, you still worship these gods, and so these Rig Veda is considered to be like the scriptures of Hindus, in the same way that a Christian would look at the Old and New Testament, or a Jew would look at the Old Testament. But the Rig Veda tells about the gods. They were polytheistic. Varuna, the sky god, Indra, the god of rain and thunder, Vishnu, the god of healing. In the Rig Veda, one of the main gods is Indra, the god of storm and lightning, kind of similar to Zeus and Jupiter. They were worshipped, or they've drawn comparisons to Thor in Scandinavian religion, because Indra was the god of storm and was also a warrior god, like Thor in the Marvel Comics series. Now, Thor was actually a Scandinavian god before it became a Marvel Comics figure. Just to let you know. But anyway, see, if you study mythology, you can get all kinds of ideas for blockbuster summertime hits. You know, you can just go through the whole. There's a lot of material out there to mine. If it's all copyright free, just take it, adapt it, make a movie, make $1 million. You know, why not? But anyway, now in the Vedic age, that's the period of the late Bronze Age, around 1400 BC. The term Raja meant warlord, and from the Rig Veda hymns, there's a lot of talk about how these warlords, with owning their vast amounts of cattle and leading their armies into battle, and during the Vedic age, the Aryans were still basically had a simple culture. They were living off of their cattle. They didn't have an advanced, complex culture as of yet. So the Rig Veda portrays a world of the late Bronze Age when the Aryans were still in a simple culture. Now, beginning around 800 BC begins the Iron Age in India. When about 800 BC, iron was introduced to India, probably through contact with the Near East. And the iron technology, the ability to take iron ore and make it into tools and weapons, this was a tremendous advance for this huge impact on this area, because it meant that now more and more people could have really good quality weapons and also tools. And some people have said that the Iron Age, the beginning of the Iron Age meant that with these new Iron Age axes and Iron Age tools, you could advance deeper and deeper into the thick jungles, the thick rainforest of central India. See, the Ganges River Valley was a jungle area. It was very hot, very humid, but it was very rich soil. The problem was eliminating all the lush vegetation. But what happened with Iron Age and tools and weapons, with Iron Age tools in particular, that meant that these Aryan farmers, could move into the Ganges River Valley of central India and begin to clear the forests and plant grain, plant rice. Rice was really good. Rice was good for these hot. Well, grain was more in Pakistan, but when they got into the Ganges River Valley, it was best for rice. So they began to grow rice in large quantities. That became one of the main staples in the diet of Indians as they advanced deeper into the more rainforest areas, the more humid areas of central India in the Ganges River Valley. You know, the Ganges is one of the longest rivers in the road. It starts longest rivers in the world. It starts up in the Himalayas and flows into the Bay of Bengal. It's a very huge river, and it could support, once they began to grow crops and raise rice, it could support a very, very heavy, large population. And so with large population growth, you begin to see the reemergence of complex cultures. And by the time you get to the period from 800 to 600 BC in India, you begin to see cities arise, new cities. Like one of the earliest cities of the Ganges River Valley was Ujjain. In Ujjain, archaeologists discovered that it was surrounded by a massive mud brick wall, that was hundreds of feet thick, which is evidence that by 600 BC, we're not talking about simple cultures anymore. We're talking about cultures capable of massive building projects, just like we expect from complex cultures. Now, the early Iron Age, the period from 800 to 600 BC in Indian history, is often called the Epic period, because it was a period that witnessed the composition of these very long epic poems. You know, the Rig Veda were hymns. They were very short. The epic poems of the epic era are very long stories told in poetry. Now, when they were first produced, they were oral poetry. They were just like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were meant to be heard rather than read. It would be centuries before they'd be written down, but they originally were epic stories. And one of the great stories, one of the great epic poems of India is the Ramayana, about the great warrior Raja, King Rama, who was one of the great heroes. You know, he's been kind of compared to Hercules or Jason and the Argonauts. You know, he was a great hero who was honored by the Indians. In fact, the Ramayana is, for modern Hindu, is still sacred scripture. I read the news a couple of years ago about how there was a big deal when this rock formation, when a local Indian geologist said this rock formation was created millions of years ago, this famous rock formation in southern India. And there was a big problem because in the Ramayana it was created by the monkey army of King Rama. The monkey army created this rock formation, and many religious Hindus were infuriated that this scientist who dared to say that this rock formation was created through a geological process that occurred millions of years ago and not created by King Rama and his monkey army. Now we laugh at that, but I'm sure Hindus laugh at Adam and Eve and laugh at the serpent and all that stuff. They probably make jokes about that, but they had their monkey army and King Rama. All right, now from the epic poetry of the Ramayana, you had it's clear that by this time you had a complex culture, and Rajas were no longer just warlords leading armies into battle. By the time you get to the epic period, the term Raja meant king, and you had the development of complex systems of government ruled by kings. And also we can see that India was developing a social class system, a kind of a social ladder. And now in India, it became part of the religion in the sense that they became to believe that the gods, the order of the universe had set it up that you belonged to a certain class, and that class or caste, that caste was where you were meant to be. And you could not leave that social class. So if you were born into a social class, that's where the order of the universe meant for you to be, and you could not leave that class. You had to marry within that class. In a caste system, whatever class you're born to, that's your class forever. You can't leave that class. You can't marry outside of that class. That's where you're meant to be. And India developed this system probably in the early Iron Age. It's called the Varna system, or caste system. Now, and this caste system for religious Hindus still exists to this day. You don't marry outside of your caste. Now in the Varna system, in the caste system, at the top you had two classes: the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas. I can't say it. my Sanskrit's not what it used to be. I never actually knew any Sanskrit, so I'm just saying that. But anyway, the Brahmins were the priests. They're the hereditary priests, and they were responsible for the rites. They were the intellectuals. They knew all the ancient rituals that needed to be done to honor the gods, to bring the god. The Hindus believed that for anything to happen right, the gods had to be present. And before anything could take place, you needed to do the proper prayers and the proper rituals to get the gods and bring them to earth and to make them present and make them active. And so the Brahmins were very important. Nothing could get done without the Brahmins. They were they did all the rituals, they did the prayers. They were the ones who learned the sacred stories, the hymns and the epic poems, and passed them down from generation to generation. So they were knowledgeable on top of knowing the ancient rituals. And then another important noble class were the Kshatriyas, the warrior class. These were Rajas, were Kshatriyas. The warrior class were those guys who all they did was be warriors. They didn't work. All they did was horses and chariots and doing battle. Now they owned estates worked by slaves to do all the agricultural labor, so they would free up their time just to be warriors. But they were the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas together made up the noble class. They were the two highest aristocratic classes, and they were the rulers and governors and the ruling class within Indian civilization. Now you also had Vaishyas, probably butchering the pronunciation, but Vaishyas were the commoners, and they could be craftsmen, they could be merchants, they could be farmers. Now, there were all these subcastes within this class. So within the Vaishya class, you would find castes of just merchants. In fact, they broke down into trades. So everybody who was engaged in the same trade, like jewelry making, jewelers, would all belong to a subcaste within the Vaishya commoner class. And then at the bottom, you have the Shudra. The Shudra would be like anybody who didn't own their own property, like a tenant farmer, a slave, somebody who just worked, didn't own any property, just worked for wages. These were the Shudras, and they were the lowest class of people. Now you also had a class of people who were called the Untouchables, and these were people who didn't have a class, and they were considered to be unclean, and you had to avoid them at all costs. If you came into contact with an untouchable, that meant you were unclean, you had to do all these ritual purifications. And today you still have untouchables, and a lot of times they do the worst kind of jobs, like they're morticians, they're garbage collectors, and they are considered to be the scum of the earth and from the perspective of everybody else. But they're people who do not have a caste. They don't belong to one of the official castes. So this caste system dates back to the early Iron Age, and for religious Hindus, it's still a part of the life and culture of modern India in the 21st century. All right, so we'll pick it up from there. We're going to talk about India. We're going to talk about China. We're going to get to all that on Wednesday.